Hey, good morning. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. This morning, I'm really thrilled and honored to have with me as my guest Rezwan Pavri, who's a partner at Wilson Sonsini. Rezwan, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Richard. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, yeah, it's so great to have you. So let me just kind of start like why you went to law school in the first place.
Gosh. Well, I didn't know how to farm, so I'll start with that. But the true answer is I came from a relatively poor immigrant family, and I myself was an immigrant, and I really didn't have much of a frame of reference as to what was out there, what the world had to offer. And so when I was at UCLA, I was uncertain what my next step was going to be, and people always kept telling me, "Well, go to law school. You can keep all your options open." And to be totally blunt, that was why I ended up going to law school. It just so happened that it was one of the most fortunate happenstances in my life because it was intellectually challenging, intellectually rigorous, and it was one of the few professions where I felt that I could make a difference, not just at one place, but I could make a difference for a lot of different organizations. Yeah. And so it's been one of the best decisions I ever made beyond marrying my wife.
Interesting. Okay, well that must rank pretty highly then. So when you were in law school, since you didn't have a preset idea of what you wanted to be, how did you make the decision to obviously become a corporate lawyer versus a litigator? Tell me a little bit about that process, if it was a decision.
It was a decision. So the business side was always the part of law that fascinated me. You know, you grow up watching TV and you think all lawyers just go to court.
Yeah.
Well, once I got to law school, I realized there was a whole lot more to it. And I was very much drawn towards capital markets, M&A. I found those types of transactions fascinating. And so that was where I was leaning. And then I went and did a clerkship, sort of a summer externship with a federal judge after my first year of law school. And that fully convinced me that corporate was the right path for me because I was not enamored of the research and writing bent of litigation.
Yeah, right. So after law school, it looks like you started your career at Cravath, the storied Cravath. What was that like?
That was intense. It was, Cravath is one of the remaining firms, I don't know how many are out there, that has a unique training model. And it was actually the thing that attracted me to Cravath. I liked that I wasn't going to go in and just do securities from day one and nothing else, or just do banking or anything else. Cravath has a rotation system. So you work for groups of partners. And I started in a securities rotation. So I did a ton of capital markets work for 2 years. And because of the nature of Cravath, I was thrown in as far into the deep end as I could be. And I was sort of the only associate running a lot of transactions as a first and second year associate. So I was doing a lot of IPOs, a lot of high yield debt offerings, both on the company side and then on the underwriter side. And then after 18 months, 2 years, you rotate to another group. And then I moved to M&A, and I did nothing but M&A for the next 2 years of my practice.
Oh, wow.
And then I moved to Europe to the London office related to my wife doing her PhD there. And so for a year, I was doing cross-border transactions. And so just the fact that you get such a broad array in your formative years as an attorney, I thought was one of the most fortunate experiences I could have had.
Interesting. Now, you didn't do litigation when you were Cravath, though.
Oh, God, no.
Yeah. Okay. So they rotated you through all the various corporate kind of practices, basically.
That's right.
What kind of hours did you work when you were Cravath? I just can't even imagine.
You know, it's a funny thing. My hours at Cravath were actually not, as a whole, in the aggregate, worse than my hours when I moved to California. And what I mean by that is at Cravath, it was very deal specific. It wasn't so much client specific. So you would have a number of months where it was 400 hours a month, back to back to back. And then you'd have a 100-hour month sprinkled in there. Whereas, on the West Coast, if you've got a good practice, you can be pretty consistent 200 to 300 every month. So the aggregate was similar, but it was much more boom and bust. And when it was boom, it was 100+ hours a week.
How about life as an associate Cravath? I mean, were you, was it pretty rough? I don't know. I just get this, you sort of have this impression that it's a pretty bad life as an associate.
It's an all-in life.
Yeah.
I lived one block from the office purposely. Most people tried to live farther away, but I knew that at a moment's notice, I could be called in. I mean, I still remember one of my senior associates calling me in on a Sunday evening for an M&A deal that we were working on, and I didn't go home for 4 days, and
Wow.
that was just life. And to this day, when I was a first-year associate, I realized that if a new transaction came in, it was just the way it was at Cravath, that you were very likely to not go home that night, because it was very different from what it is today, where people work remotely and you're offline all the time. We didn't do a lot of remote work back then. So as a first-year associate, I knew that when a new deal hit, I probably wasn't going to see my wife for a day or two. And so to this day, the way I say goodbye to her every morning is to say, I hope I see you tonight, because that started back in my days at Cravath. I hope I see you tonight.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Boy, it's like being in the military or something. So after Cravath, then why did you decide to leave Cravath?
I never thought I would leave New York. I never expected to leave Cravath. I had a great experience there. There were good times and there were tough times, but Cravath was a fantastic training ground. I wouldn't trade it for the world. But my wife and I started having kids. So we decided to start a family. So as a third-year associate, we had our first, and we realized that it was going to be very challenging without family and in Manhattan, because neither of us had family in the New York area. I still had family back in Northern California on the West Coast. So we decided it's time. It's time to move to a place where maybe we can have a little more than a one-bedroom, where we can have family around. Like, all of those things were positives, and so we moved to the Bay Area. Now, at the time when we came out, there was very little hiring in the market. It was 2003, 2004 when I wanted to come out to the Bay Area. And Wilson was one of the few firms that was hiring. I did not want to be in Palo Alto. I wanted to be in San Francisco. San Francisco did not have a robust legal market at the time. So long story short, Wilson Sonsini was the firm where I landed, and thank God I did. It really was, especially in 2004, the epicenter of what was going on. It's been a great experience.
So how did you compare initially the Wilson Sonsini or West Coast kind of model with Cravath, or the kinds of deals you were working on? I mean, was it a big contrast, or?
I would say it was not as big. There were fewer gigantic deals. Like there were, you're representing Cadbury, or you're representing Willamette, or AOL Time Warner out at Cravath. There were fewer of the $5 billion up deals when I came to Wilson Sonsini, but there was a good amount of capital markets that was coming through. There was more capital markets, certainly on the equity side at Wilson, than there was at Cravath when I was there. I would also say there was a more regular stream of M&A, because Cravath was very much a boom-bust M&A practice in my experience. And you were part of a regular cadence. You were not. Cravath's clients tended to be companies that only came for the biggest, most complex transactions. At Wilson, you were day-to-day counsel. And so even if it was board minutes and option grants and that sort of thing, you were actively involved, and you knew kind of what was going on at the company day in and day out. And so it was a more regular practice. You were almost like outside. You were almost like internal counsel, but at a law firm.
So how has your practice evolved now? I mean, are you still a mix of capital markets and M&A? Do you do startups also in there? What is kind of your mix now, or how has it evolved?
Yeah, it's actually evolved to where it is now. It starts from 2 people, a dog, and a business plan in a garage somewhere, all the way up to large public companies. And I've been very fortunate. My practice started, for the first 10 years, it was almost all large capital markets and M&A transactions. And over time, it's actually migrated earlier. And it's migrated earlier on purpose, because I find it exciting and interesting to help those folks at the very earliest stages, helping build companies from the very earliest days. Then, because I've had the opportunity of seeing companies as they grow and at their later stages, the mistakes that I've seen made at the earlier stages, when I've had to come in and clean things up, there are things that I'm able to solve for before you ever get to that point. So I've got sort of a life cycle practice that starts very early and goes through representing companies through the IPO, and onto their sales, as well as their buy-side M&A events. Post
Is it still weighted more on the large capital markets M&A with a smattering of a public company, or is it nicely distributed like you've got?
No, it's nicely distributed. I would actually say 80% or so of my clients are early to mid-stage private companies. But look, by hours, yes, it's probably still about 60% of my time is with more mature companies, because it has to be. They just require more direct attention. But from a client-based perspective, the numbers very much skew towards the early mid-stage.
Now, do you find yourself actually liking that more, or you still kind of like the M&A and the capital markets, the big deal kind of stuff, or what do you like?
I like it all. I know that sounds strange, but I'm kind of a junkie for all parts of it.
Interesting.
But I'm a junkie. I'm not going to lie and say that I love every piece of paper that comes across my desk. but regardless of whether it's small and early or late and mature, it's the strategy. At all points, it is the strategy of what the company wants to achieve and the tactics of how to achieve it that I find interesting. And so that can be true of a very early stage company, because there are very important strategic decisions that get made and set the framework for how you're going to evolve as a company. And that's true also of that big, complex public M&A deal.
Now, tell me a little bit. You're on the board of a company now. Tell me a little bit about that.
Pura, yeah, it is. A good friend of mine that I've worked with in the past. It was a director at a company, and he said, "Rez, you've got to meet these guys at Pura. They're building something special." At the time, I think they were maybe a 20 million ARR company. They will do well over 100 million this year. They're a technology-enabled fragrance and scents company. So effectively, their business model is they've got a hardware device that effectively controls scents, that allows you to control scents. It's a subscription-based product, and their view is they are going to control the scent industry globally.
Interesting.
They're well on their way, and there's no one else like them in the entire space, both on the consumer side as well as on the business side. They're now moving into other areas such as cars as well. So it's a very exciting future in an industry that probably doesn't get a whole lot of attention.
That's so interesting. I actually know quite a bit about this space, because many years ago, I was actually in-house counsel at a very small startup that was building an electronic nose to smell things. So I actually know quite a bit about scents and how odor works and how you smell. So anyways, it's a kind of a unique space, but I know quite a bit.
It is a unique space.
Yeah, totally interesting how odors detected and how it wafts. It's actually pretty interesting.
Right. They've got all kinds of science about what is the optimum curve for how much scent goes into the air and how it's absorbed. Yeah,
interesting. Cool. So now, Rezwan, obviously in your position, you see a ton of amazing opportunities, whether it's in-house or becoming a venture capitalist. I'm sure you see a ton of stuff. Have you ever thought about doing something else other than being a lawyer?
Sure. I've thought about it. Never particularly seriously.
And why is that?
Well, number one, I like being in a position where I get to learn about lots of different companies and help a lot of companies. I have a moderate to short attention span. So the ability to work on 20 different novel issues in any given day, I find exciting and interesting. If I had to spend all of my time with one client or with one situation day in and day out for a very long time, I think I'd get a little bit restless. So I find the nature of law to be exciting. And when I talk about maybe going in-house to a venture fund or something like that, I also like that within law, this is our field, for lack of a better phrase. This is our business. In many other businesses, the legal is not necessarily at the same level at the table as some of the other functions within the organization. Whereas within the law firm, we're the kings in this little world.
Well, what about becoming like a venture capitalist? Is that something or investment banker?
No one has invited me to do that. And based on my public stock picking skills, I'm not sure I'd be great at it.
So now tell me a little bit, give me a feel for kind of the technologies that you work with. I mean, I assume that most of your companies are tech companies. Do you do also life sciences and medical devices, or mostly software? Give me a little bit of feel for that.
I would say 80% plus is technology. There are life sciences included in there as well, but I'd say about 80% is in the tech side. And it is, I would say, it is traditional, but also evolving tech. So a lot of software, a lot of consumer, a lot of internet, with, as things continue to evolve, some AI companies, some fintech companies, some crypto companies. So they're, as the industry evolves, my practice tends to evolve as well.
Are you doing a lot? Are you doing a lot in the blockchain space, the token offerings, that sort of thing?
I have a few companies in that space. I have a few prominent companies in that space. So I am actively involved, but it isn't, some folks choose to focus most of their careers in one sector of technology. I tend to be more of a generalist within technology.
When you moved to the Bay Area, did you think you would end up spending your whole career there or career here, or did you think you'd move back to New York at some point?
No, I assumed that once we moved, it was going to be a permanent move. The interesting thing is I'm now actually starting to not reconsider, but I could see, my wife and I have talked about it. I could see once the kids are all off in college, we could see splitting our time between New York and Northern California as my practice continues to evolve.
Yeah. Do you miss New York at all?
I do. I do miss the energy and the excitement. There's no place on earth that's like New York. At the same time, these days when I go back, I do feel like I'm moving at a slightly slower speed than what the city moves at. Especially as I age, it is a fantastic, in my opinion, it was a terrific place to be in my 20s. I will probably have a readjustment period when I'm in my 50s.
Well, Rezwan, it's been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your taking the time. If you do happen to decide to do something else other than being a lawyer, please come back and tell me about it.
I absolutely will. It'll be my pleasure.
This is Richard Hsu and Rezwan Pavri. Thanks.